Good day, everyone. Our topic for today is about understanding sexual harassment. So first, let us tackle about sexual harassment. The International Labor Organization defines sexual harassment as a sex-based behavior that is unwelcome and offensive to the recipient. More specifically, the United Nations defines sexual harassment as any unwelcome sexual advance, request for sexual favor, verbal or physical conduct or gesture of a sexual nature, or any other behavior of a sexual nature that might reasonably expected or be perceived to cause offense or humiliation to another. Similar to other forms of violence, sexual harassment is an issue of power, control, and domination, where one person assumes entitlement to say and do whatever one pleases to another without regard for the other person's consent. Verbal examples of sexual harassment may include making sexual comments about a person's body, making sexual comments or innuendos, asking about sexual fantasies, preferences or history, asking personal questions about someone's social or sex life, making sexual comments about a person's clothing, anatomy, or looks. The tripartite model of sexual harassment include gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention, last is the sexual coercion. First is the gender harassment. Gender harassment, crude sexual verbal and nonverbal behaviors conveying insult, hostile and degrading attitudes about one's gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Examples: obscene sexual gestures, sexist jokes or comments, sending, displaying sexual objects or image. Next, unwanted sexual attention. Making suggestive, positive or negative comments about a person's body, catcalling, spreading sexual rumors, sharing sexualized image of a person to others, unwanted sexual touching, unwelcome and unreciprocated advances such as request for a kiss, date, or sex. Unwanted sexual attention covers a huge range of behaviors from being touched without permission, causing fear, alarm or distress, sexual name-calling or harassment to rape and sexual assault. Unwanted sexual attention can happen to both women and men and happen between people of the same and opposite sex. Examples of unwanted sexual behavior are touching, intimidation, unwanted email messages, intimate questions, peeping, sexual assault. There is simply no discussion about certain boundaries, but other boundaries are very individual. Sometimes behavior can therefore be transgressive without it actually being intended. Lastly is the sexual coercion. Sexual coercion or quid pro quo sexual harassment or requiring sexual contact or sexual favors as a condition to receiving rewards, benefits, employment, etc. By definition, sexual coercion is the act of using pressure, alcohol or drugs, or force to have sexual contact with someone against his or her will, and includes persistent attempts to have sexual contact with someone who has already refused. Think of sexual coercion as a spectrum or a range. Example of sexual coercion. If someone has pressured you into sexual activity or has made you feel like you owe them a sexual favor, that is considered sexual coercion. Sexual coercion doesn't have to be full-blown sex to count. It can be other sexual activities too, such as inappropriate touching. Thank you. That's all.
Philippine legislation against sexual harassment. In the Philippines, we have legislation specifically aiming to address sexual harassment. These are the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act of 1995 or RA 7877 and the Safe Spaces Act Bawal Bastos or RA 11313. An act declaring sexual harassment unlawful in the employment, education, or training environment and for other purposes. Shorter name of the law, Anti-Sexual Harassment Act of 1995 or RA 7877. What acts constitute a violation? Demanding, requesting, or otherwise requiring any sexual favor from a person, regardless of whether the demand, request, or requirement for submission is accepted by the object of the said act. Examples in the workplace. Sexual favor is made as a condition in hiring or employment, re-employment, or continued employment or granting of the said individual favorable compensation, terms of conditions, promotions, or privileges, or refusal to grant sexual favor result in limiting, segregating, or classifying the employee which in any way would discriminate, deprive, or diminish employment opportunities. Example in schools or training environment. Sexual favor is made a condition to the giving of passing grade or the granting of honors and scholarships or payment of a stipend, allowance, or other benefits, privileges, or consideration, or when the sexual advantage result in intimidating, hostile, or offensive. In what setting does the behavior count as a violation? In what setting does the behavior count as a violation of the law? Workplace, educational, and/or training environment. Who can be charged? Any person of authority having influence or moral ascendancy over another. Example: employer, manager, supervisor, teacher, professor, coach, trainer, or any other person of authority to the survivor. An act defining gender-based sexual harassment in streets, public spaces, online, workplaces, and educational or training institutions, providing protective measures and prescribing penalties therefore. Shorter name of the law, Safe Spaces Act, Bawal Bastos or RA 11313. What acts constitute a violation? Online and offline. Physical, psychological, and emotional threats, unwanted sexual remarks, wolf whistling, catcalling, unwanted invitations, misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic, sexist remarks and comments, public posts or private messages, public masturbation or flashing of private parts, grouping invasion of privacy through cyberstalking and incessant messaging, recording or sharing another person's photos, videos, or information without permission, impersonating another's identity, posting lies about another to harm their reputation, and filing false abuse report to online platform to silence another. In what setting does the behavior count as a violation of the law? Any public spaces, streets, alleys, parks, schools, churches, malls, bars, restaurants, transportation terminals, public markets, evacuation center, government offices, public utility vehicles, other recreational facilities, etc. Online spaces. Who can be charged? Anyone, person of authority, peers, subordinates, and etc.
Critical perspective of sexual harassment. Given the consequences of sexual harassment on the individual, organization, and the community in general, it is important for the community to change beliefs and behavior surrounding gender and sexuality. An important part of that means understanding some of the predominant theories about sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence. The biological or evolutionary perspective. It suggests that males' biological predisposition to mate and while to reproduce drives sexual harassment of females. However, this perspective lacks research support. The biological or evolutionary perspective on gender suggests that the roles and behavior of male and females developed over time to help with survival and reproduction. It emphasizes that many aspects of how we understand gender are shaped by our biological needs, like the different reproductive roles of men and women. The sociocultural gender perspective. It suggests that predominant gender role socialization promotes male dominance, sexual objectification of women, and cultural approval or ambivalence. Violence against women are all predictors of sexual violence, including sexual harassment. The perspective also suggests that sexual harassment is used to police socially acceptable ways of doing gender by punishing those who attempt to stray away from traditional gender role and norms. With a sociocultural gender perspective, it looks at how society shapes our ideas about gender and how those ideas contribute to sexual violence, including sexual harassment. Society often teaches us that men should be dominant and women should be passive, which leads to a culture where women are objectified and violence against them is sometimes overlooked. This creates a setting where sexual harassment happens and is even used to punish those who don't follow traditional gender expectations. In short, this perspective says that the way we are taught to understand gender rules and expectations can contribute to sexual violence and harassment. There are four specific curious hypotheses or models that describe the phenomenon of sexual harassment across various settings. The vulnerable victim hypothesis suggests that those low in socioeconomic power and status, example is women, racial and sexual minorities, and those with low organizational power, those without regular employment or hold low position in the workplace, are at greater risk of sexual harassment. It means that the vulnerable victim hypothesis suggests that individuals with low socioeconomic status or organizational power, such as women and minorities, are more likely to experience sexual harassment. Second is the power threat model. It suggests that by intimidating and discouraging women and sexual minorities, sexual harassment maintains heterosexual male dominance. For instance, women who go into male-dominated professions more often experience sexual harassment. Example is the military, seafaring, politics, online gaming, and etc. When we say power threat model, it argues that sexual harassment is used by dominant groups, especially heterosexual men, to intimidate and maintain their control over marginalized groups, as seen in male-dominated fields like the military or politics. Next is the social power theory. It suggests that harassers draw on various bases of power. For example, bosses sometimes believe that they have legitimate power to make sexual advances on their subordinates, or they may believe that they can use reward power or coercive power to sexually harass. Social power theory means that harassers use various types of powers, legitimate, reward, and coercive, to manipulate and exploit others, such as supervisors using their authority to demand sexual favors from subordinates. Last is the person by situation perspective. It suggests that various situational and personal factors combine and influence how likely harassment occurs. Situational factors such as organizational tolerance, male-dominant cultures, masculine group norms using harassment as male bonding make it more likely for people to sexually harass. Personal factors include hostile and sexist attitudes, acceptance of rape and sexual harassment needs, endorsement of traditional masculine ideology, and low empathy are some factors that make it more likely for someone to sexually harass. This perspective explains that sexual harassment happens when a mix of personal beliefs and the environmental come into play, like when someone works in a place that tolerates or ignores harassment. To sum up, each of these theories highlight how power dynamics and societal structures contribute to the occurrence and perpetuation of sexual harassment.